Few could imagine an enemy in their own backyard. Even fewer could remain calm, especially with the threats at hand. What had started as a sneaking suspicion would end as a 13-day period of agony, as the world could do nothing but stare and hope for the best. So, who was behind it all? How did it diffuse? And what does it leave behind? Close for comfort. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The year is 1955. Cuba stood great among other Latin American countries. For years, it had been the largest consumer of food, cars, radio, television, and other fine goods. Its labor force is backed by extensive unions. The economy is booming. All is well, at least on the outside. Within this country's borders, however, it's clear that all the pros had come at a cost. For the past few years, a bottomless gap had formed between the wealthiest one-third of the population compared to the poverty-ridden remainder. In an attempt to seal the gap, Fulgencio Batista, the elected president, proposed economic regulations on import and export, which only widened the difference. It was only a matter of time before a revolt would be underway. Enter Fidel Castro. Born and bred a Cuban, Castro had been a long-time opponent of Batista's government and longed for a communist society akin to that of the Soviet Union. Together with a group of armed rebels, Fidel violently seizes Santa Clara City, cutting the final string of Batista's power, pressuring his resignation and exile to a Portuguese island. Castro had grabbed the entirety of the Cuban government by the neck. Immediately after Batista's resignation, he would pick up the fallen pieces of the broken government and bring forth a communist state, the Republic of Cuba. The United States had also disapproved of Batista's rule. Upon hearing the news of a Cuban revolt, they personally placed an arms embargo on all of Cuba in the hopes that it would give Castro weaker enemies and ultimately a successful revolution. Contrary to their beliefs, Castro's democratic revolution turned into a Marxist bloodbath, quickly forcing the U.S. to withdraw support and place a trade ban on Cuba. This did nothing to hamper Fidel, as in a likewise manner he too began to push out Western influence. The political divide pushed Cuba's government to the Soviet Union's shores, leading to many economic and infrastructure-related plans that would come in handy for the future.
Cuba's Fidel Castro arrives at New York's Idlewild Field, the first in a parade of heads of government that includes nearly every Iron Curtain nation and Russian ally, all on hand for the opening of the United Nations 15th General Assembly. Surrounded by a heavy security guard, Castro appears subdued. Unlike the 3 or 4 hour orations he delivers in Havana broadcasts, his arrival speech is only a few words.
I only want to salute to the people of the United States. And I don't want to do, my English is the same like the other time. About the other things that I want to tell, I wish that you wait to the General Assembly of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
The first red satellite chieftains to arrive in New York are Novotny of Czechoslovakia and Poland's Gomulka. They are not greeted by any United States representative, not being guests of this country. Novotny makes an arrival speech in his own tongue. Despite their status as high-ranking red leaders, both Novotny and Gomulka are almost ignored by the numerous pickets and demonstrators, many of them East European refugees who protested the arrival of Khrushchev and other leading Reds on the SS Baltica. The Russian liner on which Mr. K sailed with the heads of 5 satellite states arrived on a dank and foggy morning. Heading up the East River to the deep water dock closest to UN headquarters, it was harassed by cruising parties of hecklers. One boat was hired by the Longshoremen's Union. Ashore, hundreds of demonstrators massed, despite...
The United States was no stranger to international intervention. From Korea to Africa, they had a hand in almost all countries debating the choice of the century. In a few years, the CIA would take Cuban exiles and refugees, train and arm them, before leaving them to take back their own country at the Bay of Pigs. Out of the 1,400 people strong militia, 100 would be killed and the rest imprisoned. This utter failure on the United States' part would encourage Castro and his Soviet allies to perceive Kennedy as too young, intellectual, not prepared well for decision-making in crisis situations, too intelligent and too weak. Chapter 1. The Dragon Lady. As early as August of 1962, U-2 reconnaissance aircraft picked up a peculiar sight. The onboard cameras had located what were clearly weapons placed at ports in various parts of the mainland. Curiously, these weapons ranged from MiG-21 interceptors, IL-28 light bombers, surface-to-air missiles, and hundreds of anti-aircraft emplacements. All of these shipments were Soviet in origin and even followed Soviet layouts.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
By the 21st of October, the worst had been confirmed. For the past months, the Soviet Union had discreetly shipped thousands of infantry units, hundreds of surface-to-air missiles, dozens of aircraft, and a handful of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Using the recently established economic plan as cover, the Soviet Union would smuggle the weaponry within containers on commercial ships. As a result, President John F. Kennedy and ExComm, or the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, were left with no choice but to place a naval blockade all around the island. From above, reconnaissance flights increased in intensity. Each flight returned with nothing close to glad tidings. Only 4 days later, Kennedy was informed that the naval blockade had no effect on Cuban missile development and the installation of nuclear warheads was complete. At this point, the world could do nothing but hold their breath. The rising intensity of threats issued by the Cuban and Soviet states, coupled with the US's return threats, left each power on edge. The very next morning, President Kennedy approached ExComm with a planned invasion of the Cuban island, complete with a provisional democratic government. Each side now had malicious intent toward the other, and tensions would only continue to escalate. Chapter 2. A Loaded Gun. At that moment, Kennedy was presented with 6 choices as a response to the Cubans. The first, he could do nothing. American vulnerability to Soviet missiles was not new. For the second, he could choose diplomacy. Through use of diplomatic pressure, he could get the Soviet Union to remove the missiles and restore peace. The third was a secret approach, through which he could offer Castro the choice of splitting with the Soviets and removing the missiles, or risking invasion. The fourth is invasion, a full-force invasion of Cuba and the overthrow of Castro with the institution of a provisional government. The fifth is an airstrike, which utilizes the use of the U.S. Air Force to attack all known missile sites. And the final choice was to use a blockade, with the U.S. Navy to block any missiles from arriving in Cuba. Instead, Kennedy chose to further survey Cuba, increasing the frequency of recon flights from 2 a day to 1 every 2 hours. Kennedy had agreed with a small group of officials that he would initiate an invasion on Cuban soil in the case an American aircraft or asset was attacked. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense at the time, had elaborated on this 40 years later, stating, We had to send a U-2 over to gain reconnaissance information on whether the Soviet missiles were becoming operational. We believed that if the U-2 was shot down, that the Cubans didn't have capabilities to shoot it down, the Soviets did. We believed if it was shot down, it would be shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile unit, and that it would represent a decision by the Soviets to escalate the conflict. And therefore, before we sent the U-2 out, we agreed that if it was shot down, we couldn't meet, we'd simply attack. On the morning of October 27, a U-2F piloted by U.S. Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson departed from McCoy Air Base in Florida. At about 12 p.m., Cuban radar had locked onto the U-2 and launched a Soviet-made SA-2. The explosion of the missile quickly crippled the aircraft and killed Rudolph Anderson. The U-2 would crash over Cuban territory and will be considered as a victorious moment for the Cubans onwards. Similarly, on that same day, multiple RF-8A Crusaders, which were reconnaissance modifications of their fighter variant, had taken slight damage from anti-aircraft fire, but without any casualties. Just like the skies above Cuba, its waters were fraught with danger. The B-59, a Foxtrot-class Soviet submarine, was sent to support the arms shipments throughout the Caribbean in case of a war. On October the 27th, the same day that the U-2F was shot down, the United States Navy had located the submarine and dropped small depth charges as a means of signaling in order to coax them to resurface. Unaware of its non-violent intentions, the submarine crew were placed on alert. Before departing, they were armed with a nuclear torpedo and were instructed only to use it in case of damage from depth charges or surface fire. In order to execute the nuclear strike, the commanding officers must all agree or they must radio for an outside opinion. Unfortunately, the sub was located too low underwater to be able to receive radio transmissions. Thus, the decision lay in the hands of the three commanding officers. Among them was Vasily Arkhipov, the commander of the submarine flotilla. He, against the beliefs of the two other officers, objected to the launch. Without his permission, the nuclear strike could not be carried out. They would later resurface to several American vessels and aircraft surrounding them, and years later, Vasily would be credited with preventing a nuclear strike, which could have obviously scaled into thermonuclear war. Chapter 3. Defusing. On the 26th of October, a day prior to the climaxing tensions, the State Department had received a large letter that had been personally written by Khrushchev. The letter itself took several minutes to print and even longer to be translated. Within the letter, Khrushchev had written, "I propose we, for our part, will declare that our ships bound for Cuba are not carrying any armaments. You will declare that the United States will not invade Cuba with its troops and will not support any other forces which might intend to invade Cuba. Then the necessity of the presence of our military specialists in Cuba will disappear." This letter proved to be nothing short of relieving. The very next day, on the 27th, Kennedy met with Khrushchev's representatives in Yenching Palace Chinese restaurant. Deep within the table conversation, the Soviets presented their proposal. In order for the missile systems to be packed up and sent back to the USSR, the United States must also agree to removing their Jupiter missiles located in Turkey and Italy. Similar to the Soviet missiles, when placed in a surrounding country, these missiles had enough range and coverage to explode over any part of Eastern Europe and most of Russia. Against the opinions of Italy and Turkey, the USA came to agree to these terms and slowly removed the Jupiter missiles. The Soviet Union followed suit by packing up all missile sites and destroying any remainders. Finally, the threat of nuclear war had ceased once more. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. The 13-day conflict that would go down in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis left far-reaching impacts on all corners of the globe. For Cuba, it was a humiliating failure. From this point on, Castro would disapprove of Khrushchev, and Soviet-Cuban relations would quickly diminish. For the Soviet Union and the USA, it was a wake-up call. No longer should they have to live in a world where nuclear war is a high possibility. A few days after the naval blockade was lifted, Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy once more, outlining a plan for easing tensions between the two powers, starting with a non-aggression pact between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, or even their ultimate disbanding. Khrushchev also went on to add other terms such as the resolution of the recognition of the two Germanys by each other, or the recognition of mainland China as a country. Kennedy responded in a lukewarm manner and instead proposed for a hotline to be constructed between Moscow and Washington. For Khrushchev, the mitigation of the crisis was nothing short of an embarrassment. At the time, the removal of missiles from Turkey and Italy had been made a private deal between Khrushchev and Kennedy, so Khrushchev's removal of the missiles from Cuba was perceived as a cowardly retreat. This helped to quicken his resignation, and the election of Leonid Brezhnev was to take his place. For other states, the end of the crisis had left peace once again. Romania, having seen the missiles placed in Cuba, wrote a letter to the Kennedy administration in an attempt to disassociate their country from the Soviet actions. This helped increase American-Romanian relations and became important during the destabilization of the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro would continue to serve before retiring on the 19th of April, 2011. He would live 5 more years before dying of undisclosed reasons at the age of 90. It was revealed by Kennedy later on that Castro had not wanted the missiles, but was rather pressured by Khrushchev into accepting them. It was from there that Castro planned on using the missiles only in the case of an assault on Cuban territory. Kennedy was applauded for his performance during the missile crisis and would continue to serve before his untimely death during a parade. This has been quite the project, but I'm glad it's over. I hope you enjoy it, and I will hopefully see you around. Please consider subscribing to support this channel and leave a comment. Thanks.